Okay, yeah, Adam Cole. I'm the founder of Join the Journey. Started Join the Journey out of just a heart and passion to serve people in some very broken places, particularly in Haiti, just after the earthquake. Saw a lot of that hurt up close, and decided to just make a go of this charity thing. That's the way I saw it back then. Just build a nonprofit allows you a mechanism to be in people's lives and deliver compassion. And then, through that journey, just discovered what it took to really get people out of poverty. Certainly, I don't think people want to help someone, as they say, give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man a fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. So, we started that journey of just what does that look like, and then found ourselves in the microfinance space through that journey. So yeah, glad to be here on this Impactathon conversation, and soon to do an Impactathon with y'all of inspiring that change in young entrepreneurs.
Great, and my name is Gillian Foster Wilkinson, and I work for Hope International, which is a microfinance and savings group network that serves in 16 countries around the world, and I work on our microfinance team. So I have the pleasure of working with locally led microfinance institutions in East and Central Africa, Eastern Europe, South Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I am really passionate about economic empowerment because I think it gets at some of the root challenges of poverty. I think all of us have come across something where we see the injustice of poverty or lack of access to resources. And it's really easy to get caught up in symptoms of poverty. People not having X or people not having access to Y. And there's definitely systemic and larger scale issues that do require advocacy, policy reform, governmental reform, things like that. But I think at the ground up level, there's a question of how do we get people more resources that they have agency and control over, more options that they get to decide what to do with, and ultimately increase their earnings, increase their income, increase what they have access to and ownership over. Families know what their families need, parents know what their kids need. And so I'm really passionate about economic empowerment as really this foundational level of the challenges of poverty, of how do you give people more money in their hands, more opportunities to earn income, that sort of thing, so that then they can put their money to where their values are versus coming in with material aid or responding to some symptoms of poverty that a family might not even be that bothered by. They have other priorities. They have other places where they would put resources if they were able to. So that's what I think is great about microfinance, is trying to increase people's access to increasing their income and having more control over their own financial resources versus, especially as a person who's supporting a global network, but I'm personally based in the US, I don't know what's best for people. And I don't want to assume that sort of influence or knowledge or wisdom that I just don't have. But by supporting our local institutions and getting more financial resources to people who know what they want and how they want to address the issues in their lives, I think that's what's exciting about economic empowerment, is that it can be foundational for flourishing and improvement in all areas of lives.
That's great. And so let's actually take something out of the abstract and make it a little bit more concrete and not assume. Can each of you explain how you define microfinance, and what is it, and how you've seen through your work it can uplift individuals and communities out of poverty?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first and Adam fill in. So microfinance is basically saying what financial instruments, financial tools are useful, and basically how to meet the needs of low-income earners or people who are closer to the bottom of the global economic pyramid who are normally not served by commercial banks. And so, people are super resourceful and they're super shrewd. So, people find a way to make things work. And I think microfinance is saying, instead of forcing people to rely on just themselves or their immediate family if a financial need comes up, or if they want to grow their business, or if they want to save, what does it look like to make financial services actually meet their needs and actually be something that they want to use and that can serve them as they manage their financial resources? So you may have heard of like Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank and village banking, the idea of people coming together in groups, providing social collateral and getting access to small loans that are most of the time used to increase business activities and increase income, so that people can have a small bulk amount of savings or a loan all at once, which normally you can't get access to a really, really small business loan from a commercial bank. So microfinance institutions are trying to tailor both the scale of the services and the way they're delivered to people who aren't normally served by the financial industry. And I think it's also really important that we're not just making smaller versions of commercial financial services, but thinking about what is actually getting at the heart and the desires of our clients' needs, and having a client-centered approach. So microfinance services might look really different than commercial financial services, but it's about trying to get those financial tools, those financial instruments in a way that actually benefits our end user. What would you add, Adam?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think in reality, what we do, at least at Join the Journey, is kind of twofold, and we call it microfinance because I think, as Gillian said, the key part of it is the actual financial instrument. But I think in terms of the empowerment process, it's kind of like looking at it in terms of establishing mini incubators or small cell incubator methodology, and to number one, provide some backbone of training, some backbone of mentorship and group solidarity, and then let people, as Julian said, let them be ingenuous, let them be just as we call in the entrepreneurial world, just use that grit, and they have a lot of it. So yeah, I think she's hit it all on the head. It's its basic premise. It's providing the capital to those that otherwise wouldn't qualify for it. I think for those that are honest, listen to this talk. It's hard to wrap your head around what does $100 do for someone. We sometimes spend $100 at Walmart on any given Sunday. But for those places that live literally on pennies a day, and you tell them you can get them $100 and they can open up a small scale shop, with that, the light bulb starts to turn on. So yeah, it's an amazing process, particularly in this idea that there is still the very cash economies. We call those in our world the informal economies. But in some of these places where everything's informal, it's how people live. And if you don't have that capital, if you don't have the ability to raise up some of those goods and services, then you're kind of just stuck in a lot of ways, because there's not a lot of capital moving in other means either. They don't have sort of, in some of these places, a working class economy, or sort of a white collar professional service economy. It's just a matter of maybe small scale farmers in a community, and then trying to get outputs out. So from an economic standpoint, it can get pretty complex. When you have inputs, it allows those people in the community to kind of receive those and grow and sort of create circular economies.
Yeah, I might also just add one more piece to what Adam was sharing, especially around the idea of access to small loans and how transformational that can be. I will say, I think there's been a lot of fair criticism of microfinance over the past like 5 to 7 years, because I think people were really excited about it when people learned of the ideas of Muhammad Yunus, especially village banking, and the idea if we just give people access to a small business loan, this will solve all the problems. And so I think anyone looking for a silver bullet for global poverty is going to be continually disappointed. But I think of microfinance just because I have access to a credit co-op in my neighborhood that's supporting small businesses doesn't mean that automatically that my income has gone up. But I can imagine a world where I don't have access to any financial services because commercial banks don't see value giving out a $400 loan, or there's just no services that I'm personally interested in life or flourishing. And so I think that's where financial inclusion is a really important piece of this. Of there's still millions and millions of people around the world who don't have access to any sort of ways to have small amounts of credit, have a safe to save, even things like microinsurance. There's some really interesting things that are happening in microfinance that aren't just access to small business loans. But for small business loans, I think they continue to be the biggest part of microfinance. And I think sometimes when we say microfinance, we're really meaning microcredit. And I think that's because so much of the global world and folks who are working their way up out of the bottom half of the economic pyramid are necessity entrepreneurs. And I think that's a really important thing to understand too, of like Adam was saying, thinking about economies and the fact that there may be government institutions or foreign direct investment or corporations in a country that overall has a pretty low average income. And then you have a lot of people working in the informal economy, but no middle class, no places where people are going and get jobs at firms that are paying them a salary and, consistent income, benefits, that sort of thing. There's this really big gap between corporations and institutions and then the informal economy. And so as people are not having jobs offered to them, and there is going to be an increasing job shortage in a lot of places around the world as younger demographics mature and look for jobs and they're not available. Entrepreneurship is really this opportunity for people to create value, create their own incomes, provide goods and services that aren't available in their communities or in their cities, or they could be improved upon. And that's where I think if you have the combination of there's no jobs available to me, but I also can't get any sort of credit to start a business, or I can't get any sort of input or investment in my business to grow it, people really get stuck. And I think that's where financial inclusion and access to credit and microcredit can be really powerful. And there's some incredible stories of Hope's clients around the world that I don't think Hope would take credit for. We would say they were clearly a gifted entrepreneur, but hopefully we help them get there faster. There's an example of Jean-Marie in Rwanda who had a small, corner stall where he was selling food every day. And then as he accessed his first small business loan, his business activities grew. He ultimately ended up with owning a full restaurant. And he was clearly gifted and clearly had a vision for his business, but there wasn't anyone else who was going to lend to him other than Hope's partner in Rwanda at that time. And so as his business grew, he ended up hiring over a dozen full-time employees. He ended up creating an authentic farm-to-table experience where he wasn't happy with the quality of the produce he was getting for his restaurant. So he said, I'll just start my own small farm behind the restaurant. And so you hear his story. He ultimately ended up adopting several orphans because he felt like, I've been blessed in my business. For whatever reason, God has allowed me to have this success, and I need to give back to my community, and I need to share this blessing with others. And so clearly an inspirational person, I think would have been inspirational, would have found success some way, but microfinance and that access to those first early business loans helps them get there a little bit faster. instead of waiting until he could maybe save for his next investment in his business, they're taking years instead of months without access to some sort of loan or some sort of financial service. So those are definitely the stories that keep me excited of seeing how it's not going to necessarily be the one solo answer for everyone, but there's a real opportunity to meet people where they are and give them more options and make sure that they are financially included and can access things that can help them grow in their situation.
That's great. And you both have brought up something in different ways. Adam talked about kind of adapting to the informal economy and being able to provide tools and services. You mentioned meeting people where they are. So I wonder if you both can kind of talk about how you have adapted your offerings to, like, one of the elements, the key elements of design thinking that we work with entrepreneurs often is really having empathy and understanding of the community that you're serving. So it's not enough to say, oh, this is what I think the solution is, and let me just push it forward. It's like listening to where the gaps are, what the need is, and then adapting. So would love to hear how you've adapted. And Adam, I know like there's the app that's being released. Like maybe that's part of that, where you saw a need or an opportunity to use technology to better serve. So that might be something to share. But yeah, would love to hear those examples as well. It might help the problem solvers also realize that just the idea of microfinance, while very powerful, would have to be adapted and designed for the community that you're serving.
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. No, I think it's not necessarily financial arm that's adapted per se. More of the leaders that you grow in a certain community to provide the oversight. I think especially if we look at the types of microfinance, delivery mechanisms, at least that we at Join the Journey do, and I'm sure, you can find the same characteristics in any sort of microfinance program, is that it is village banking. It is somewhat characteristics of that, where you have direct touch points, and how those people, number one, understand those actors, shall we say, those agents of the capital, really sets a tone for how that program will run. In our experience, we've learned a lot of lessons and how we've shaped that process. And we are a faith-based organization, so we pride ourselves on connecting with communities via the church, because there is a community model already established there. But we recognize too that it's unfair to put those people that are in positions to deliver, religious services, for lack of a better word, to also make them do financial services. It's kind of like a church and state thing that you can't intertwine. So over time, our adaptability is learning and seeing how we can sort of split those, but with the same effect, by investing in communities and really inspiring entrepreneurs. Now, for us, as you mentioned, just as a personal plug, we have launched the Spark app. These are basically crowdfunding capability. We are sort of niche capability in the microfinance space that isn't completely niche. I mean, there's other people that do it. Kiva is one of the biggest ones, but we really do a crowdfunding capability, which has its pluses and minuses to actual development and poverty alleviation. What it does is at least provides a direct connection between a potential lender, those in what we call the developing world, and those developed in developing world. And so we really try to match those people intricately. And us, that's half of our work. It's just finding people that care about entrepreneurship and want to take part in that. Now, for us, we're actually still in the testing phase of how this app will play on the ground. We're already seeing that not a lot of people obviously have smartphones to do some of the updates. So we're really having to remodel and kind of empower, again, those agents to be able to facilitate some of those conversations. And, just one thing just to add too in the microfinance space that we're leveraging off of is not necessarily integral to the app, but it is, being able to deliver capital via the telecom network. So we send dollars through an SMS code. And through that means that's using technology. It allows us to send funds to anyone in the world, whether it's a bank or not a bank. So I think that's a unique aspect of, if you look at how we can use finance, particularly in these rural areas and particularly for the underserved, to save costs but deliver the same impact. Gillian?
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the world of fintech or financial technology, as Adam was sharing, using mobile money or things like that to keep pushing the boundaries of who's financially included and who's not. I think, just speaking from my experience of Hope, I think the biggest thing about being centered around the end user and client-centered with a design lens is really resisting this idea of like, if we build it, they will come. I think especially when you see something work in one context and you think it can automatically be applied to another, whatever your plan or idea or intervention or innovation is, I think there's absolutely an ability to take best practices and try them in another environment. But I think even for something like an Impactathon or a hackathon, like, it's okay and even really wise to start small if it's something that is a totally new idea. It might be a little bit less exciting to say your first target group is a group of 50 families in a rural community. But if that's your target group, then that's great. Start there, and there's always the opportunity to grow. I think sometimes we can get really focused on scalability and anything and forget that some of the places where there are still these really deep pockets of lack of access to financial services, lack of access to supply chains or markets or all those things where it's like, okay, you've taught a man to fish, that's great, but there's no lake near him. So like, what does it look like to maybe teach him to farm now or whatever it is, or connect him to where the fish are, that sort of thing. It's kind of like the idea of like last mile delivery. Like, things are really scalable when you're in a city, when a lot of people have smartphones, when you can, push something that a lot of people have access to. But what does it look like for that 20% that's remaining on the margins? What does it look like for the communities that are discriminated against within their own cities or within their own countries? What does it look like for those underserved groups? There's a reason they're underserved. And I think that's what I get most excited about, is how do we get things to people who it's difficult to serve, not because of who they are, but just because of cultural or economic or political or systemic reasons. They still haven't been fully offered the same resources or opportunities. And so I think it's okay to say, this is a real problem that I'm passionate about, but it's a real problem for a reason. So let's start small, let's test something, let's make sure at some point as early on in the process, we're getting feedback from our actual end users, and then, growing from there. Because I think that is maybe some of the valid criticism of traditional microfinance is, well, you can advertise a $400 startup business loan, and then if people don't take it, does that mean microfinance failed? It's like, no, it probably just means that wasn't meeting people's needs in that situation, but it doesn't mean there aren't other financial needs or there aren't other opportunities to adapt. And so, and I think that's where it's also, if you're passionate about a group that's outside of the group that you're a part of, a member of, or have, lived with, it's also so important to make sure that you have local leadership and also local voice over things like the budget and the plans and the objectives and things like that, so that we also keep resisting, I think, our like normal human urge to solve things for other people, and then we accidentally come alongside and take away agency or promote our perspectives, especially coming from the West, where often a lot of the resources are, or a lot of our funders are, a lot of our foundations and institutes are that are making funds for, or making grants for these sort of projects. But how do we resist the urge to solve things for people, but actually like work alongside them? And that definitely isn't just a microfinance thing, but I think anything that we get excited about, it's also good to like check ourselves and go at a more sustainable pace and actually test something, actually get feedback, and make sure that local voice is involved in everything we're doing.
That's great. Great conversation. So the final question, and this is very interesting to ask to both of you who are deeply involved in poverty alleviation, economic empowerment, but do you believe that poverty is solvable, and what kind of mindset will it take to actually solve it? And so, yeah, I'll leave that to both of you.
Kind of in a standoff of who unmutes first with the $1 million question. So I think with the question, is poverty solvable? I think looking to what has happened in even the last 50 to 60 years is really encouraging, where we see global poverty rates being cut dramatically around the world. And a lot of that having to do with economic development and economic growth. And as I was mentioning earlier, in a lot of lower income countries, the massive gap between the corporations and the institutions and the informal economy. And what we see in economic development is that as that gap is closed, not necessarily that those two are coming back together, but there is a middle class being built up in the middle. That's where a lot of wealth creation and value creation resides, are in those small businesses and in those small to medium-sized businesses, even in the, in places with very developed high income economies. Most of the jobs and most of the value creation actually is in that in between middle-sized business range. And so I think as we've seen those businesses grow and creating value, we have seen poverty be reduced around the world. And I think that's exciting, that's where the trend is going. I know our news cycle doesn't like to tell us positive things because it doesn't get us to tune in, but there's a lot of really good news about global poverty, about what is the poverty rate? It keeps increasing, and it's increasing faster than inflation. Is it $2 a day? Is it $3 a day? That sort of thing, because people are, smaller percentages of people are living in that truly abject poverty. So I think it is solvable because we're already seeing massive progress. I think the challenge right now, given COVID and given, governments and economies that are more cut off from each other now than they have been in decades, because people are closing borders because they're concerned about the spread of COVID, more nationalistic sentiments and movements that existed before COVID that are now just exacerbated by COVID, right? Where countries are being more closed off to each other. Man, trade is so good for consumers and economies. And so even at the microfinance level, we have a lot of clients who live near borders, and the borders go in the middle of a city that on one country is this country's side of the city. On the other country's side, it's a different city name, but that city functions as an economic unit. And so we have a lot of border traders who will buy on one side, cross the border and sell, and vice versa, and they haven't been able to do that because of COVID. And it's really a question of, when will that border reopen for traders? We really don't know. And so I think while we have this exciting history of progress over the last several decades, right now, one of the challenges is, how do we build local sustainability, local value creation when crossing borders, when global trade is being limited because of the global context right now. And so I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of things that haven't been tried yet, because it wasn't necessary before. So what does local agricultural supply chain development look like? That where there's a business opportunity, but you're also meeting local food needs when you can't rely on importing things from other countries, whether that's because of socio-political things or because of concerns about a pandemic. So yes, I think it's solvable. I think our history is pointing to that, but I think also right now we're facing a new challenge as countries are more isolated from each other due to just the global context right now.
No, that was awesome, Gillian, and that's hard to follow, but I think you hit on a lot of good points of just, the progress that's been made. When I look at that question, I think, what does solve mean? And I get, as we're trying to do this Impactathon, and we have this sort of hanging question, can poverty be solved? Now, I think in general, poverty isn't necessarily something to be solved per se. And just to kind of liken our own organizational messaging, we see it as the journey. I think we try to find individuals and kind of inspire them beyond themselves. And so a lot of times I think you have to set goals. And so UN has done a pretty good job of setting goals for what does getting out of poverty mean. Okay, well, it means having your income higher, it means maybe health outputs. And so I think, unfortunately, just in general, because we like frameworks, we're always fencing it off based on that. But, for what I see in this environment that I feel in, I look at it more on ways that people go about transformation at the individual levels. Whether it's the mother of three that all of a sudden can send their kid to school with their earnings, able to provide for shelter. And I think one thing to recognize that I think a lot of us do in this space is to realize that even as we look at poverty, it's much different perspective from those. And because it's just life, it's not poverty, it's life. Certainly they have a certain perspective of wanting more. They want some of the same comforts, but at the same time, there's many things they relish in that environment: the community, the closeness, the fact that they are connected to so many people. And so I think in that regard, we inspire them and we give them hope through financial resources, but also in our craft, from faith-based components that they can cling to. We see life and kind of tie this all back to this Impactathon, Future Flourishing. And as we look at what does it mean to inspire and bring some of these interventions, just to ask, are you flourishing? And the answer is yes, and I think we're there on the journey.
Yeah, Adam, I love what you brought up about let's not bring our views of like what poverty or flourishing is to those we're seeking to work with, but because our values are cultural, values are different in different places. But yeah, I love that, bringing back to flourishing where it might not be my values, but if people have resources that they're able to invest in what they value and what their priorities are, and that contributes to their flourishing, then that's great, even if it looks very different than myself as a white American would expect it to look like. Who cares? And I think that's where economic empowerment does get at a more holistic thing than just economics or just finances, is that it's giving those resources to people who know how they want to use them and how they want to flourish in their context.
That's really great. Well, this is a really strong note to end on, to really focus on this idea of flourishing and moving forward and transformation. So I want to thank you both, for being part of this, Adam for being a partner in this, our collaborator, and we're excited to see you all at Impactathon in just a week now. So thank you guys so much.
So much